Hello and welcome back. This is Dr. Jordan again, and I would like to basically discuss Renaissance music. Um, but of course, you can't discuss the music without discussing the social and historical context. So let me give you a little bit about the context of the Renaissance. Like, for instance, why do we call it the Renaissance? It means the word, of course, literally means rebirth, renaissance in French. But what was reborn? Um, and it's hard to say what was reborn sometimes because um, things had been kind of progressing to the point that they became kind of called this Renaissance or this rebirth. But the roots of the Renaissance go back at least 150 years, if not more. So don't get the idea that it just kind of emerged out of the medieval period. Um, but we see some trends here after the year 1450 that accelerate the pace of social and technological change. And so we get it's what we mean by Renaissance is we get a rebirth of learning and technology and information that basically creates the modern Western European and North American world. Um, and it all begins in 1450. Why? Well, something was invented in 1450 that changed everything. It was an information revolution, um, similar to the personal computer, if you will, and the internet. It's we're living in an era of an information revolution right now, and the internet 1.0, I guess you would call it, um, was this wonderful invention called, wait for it, the printing press. There it is, this technological wonder. So what's so great about the printing press? Well, before 1450, um, books had to be transmitted by hand. Uh, so when the pages of a book wore out, and when the book was uh, facing the end of its natural life, a scribe had to sit down and copy that book so that the information in that book could be preserved. And medieval monasteries were places where that sort of thing went on. And so for centuries and centuries, books had to be preserved by being copied. The older the book is, the less we, um, the less, what's the word? The older the book is, say, for instance, Plato. Uh, Plato was copied by hand for literally thousands of years. We don't have the original documents that Plato wrote, or at least that Plato's scribe wrote when he dictated it. We have no original documents for Plato. Everything that we have about that Plato said or wrote is included, it was copied. And so we have copies of copies of copies of copies. The same is true for the Bible, the New Testament, and the Old Testament. What we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. So we don't have any of the original documents. And But with the advent of printing, we can print a book um, and easily distribute that book. Because books had to be copied before 1450, it was hard to distribute them. For one thing, they were outrageously expensive. So if you wanted a book to be copied, you have to pay a huge amount of money to get the book copied, and then it really belonged to a community more than it did an individual. Very few individuals owned books, and besides, hardly anyone could read because books were so expensive. You couldn't read. Uh, there was no reason to learn to read. You're not going to be able to afford a book, so why learn to read? So maybe literacy levels were between 5 and 10% of the given population. and they rose and fell depending on plagues and wars and other sorts of famines. The four horsemen basically determined literacy levels. But here now, because the price of books comes down, and they can be easily printed and distributed in large quantities, and they can be sold in bookshops over huge geographic areas. So this allows information to be transmitted widely and cheaply, and pretty soon literacy rates and levels begin to rise, and they rise quickly. Now that you can read a book, uh, this is a great thing. Now we can basically buy books, and we can stock our own library, and we can read widely. Um, so this printing press is an incredible invention, and it has a lot of social effects, as we'll see, um, because you know because people can read now. They can read the Bible for themselves. The Bible's translated and printed, so they can see what it says. And boy, does that create some interesting developments. um, and uh, and people can study all kinds. There are all kinds of how-to manuals published, how to build a musical instrument, for instance. So instrumental music technology begins to grow, and people begin to construct more efficient musical instruments. And so that has an effect on the history of music. And so we have all kinds of technological innovations that come as a result of people reading books. Um, and we'll talk about this. On this slide, you see a painting of Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus was one of the leading humanist scholars of the Renaissance. Well, so we see with the advent of printing and with the advent of the distribution of cheap books, we see also the advent of humanism. In the Middle Ages, life was lived for the your reward in heaven. Everything on life really led you to your eternal reward in heaven. So they're focused on the future, pie in the sky, by and by, if you will. Whereas during the Renaissance, we see the rise of humanism. The humanists are not concerned with the afterlife and the hereafter so much as they are concerned with the here and now. How do we improve the lives of people in the here and now? Well, technology can help. We can publish books on medical practices to help people heal. We can discuss disease. We can publish books on how to paint a picture using perspective and create 3 dimensions out of 2. We can publish books about exploration, how to go farther, faster, and find money-making devices easier. All of these things create this rise of humanism. We can publish findings on the planets, and right, like Copernicus did. Copernicus said, "Well, sorry, the church is wrong, and Ptolemy was wrong. The Earth is not the center of the solar system; the sun is." And these planets, including Earth, revolve around the sun in orbits. That was what Copernicus said. Fortunately for Copernicus, in a way, he died before the church could get to him. Galileo confirmed his findings, but was not as fortunate. He lived and was forced to recant his findings by the church, because the church was just literally married to the idea that the Earth is the center of the solar system. So there you go. So humanism, this focus on the here and now and not the hereafter, that leads to really what we would call the modern scientific method that begins to be developed during and certainly after the Renaissance. This is a big step towards the future of thought in Western Europe. There you see an, a sculpture from the first century AD. This sculpture was discovered when they were basically clearing the ruins of the old St. Peter's to make room for the new St. Peter's around the year 1500. And this sculpture, even though it comes from the first century AD, the Greco-Roman antique world, that it had an enormous effect on sculptors and many others, simply because it is so detailed anatomically. St. Peter's, as you might know or not, is built over a necropolis, an ancient Roman cemetery. And that cemetery had all kinds of sculptures like this. This is in the Vatican Library in Rome today. So you can see it. It's in actually the Vatican Museum. So these humanist scholars are very interested in Greco-Roman classical antiquity. And that interest continues right through the 18th century. So if you're dealing with music of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, you're going to come across, references to the ancient Greco-Roman world. They studied Greek and Latin. They read Greek and Latin literature from the Greco-Roman ancient world. And so everything they did really had references to the Greco-Roman world. When this thing came out of the ground, as they were basically laying the foundation for the new St. Peter's, which is still there, when this thing came out of the ground, Raphael, Michelangelo, and many other painters and sculptors were there to see it, and they were impressed. Look at the anatomical knowledge that this sculptor, whoever he was, had. Pectorals, deltoids, triceps, biceps, intercostals, on and on. There's a quadrilateral, it just goes on and on. These people knew what was underneath the skin. They had actually dissected corpses. And they knew what was there. So they portrayed the human anatomy in detail. Now, well, you're thinking, well, so what? Who cares about that? Well, listen, during the medieval period, it was illegal to dissect a corpse. You could not cut open a cadaver and find out what was underneath the skin. You could be punished severely, if not actually executed. Consequently, people who saw this, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raffaello, these painters and sculptors, when they saw this, they said, we need to do this. We need to dissect some cadavers. So in secret at night, in basements, locked away from everyone outside, they secretly got a hold of dead bodies and began to dissect them. And their painting, sculpture, et cetera, basically begins to look a lot like this. So if you look at medieval paintings, there's virtually no anatomical realism at all. They're just kind of the human body kind of is a blob kind of sit out there. Very often they wear a lot of clothes that hide the body so no one can see what's there, because they had no idea how to paint or sculpt a human body. But here, long around the year 1500, the human body starts looking very much like a human body. Obviously, this guy is in the shape of a professional athlete. Um, my body certainly doesn't resemble that. But nevertheless, you see that anatomic detail, very important. There you see Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Um, they created the Spanish nation by marriage. Uh, Ferdinand was from Aragon, Isabella was from Castile, and when they got married, they created the modern nation state of Spain, España. Um, well, why is this important? This had been happening in the Middle Ages. These states that were sort of loosely organized in a feudal governmental system are now being consolidated and coming together as nations. So now we have uh, France being consolidated and coming together as a nation. Um, and Spain, Spain is kind of the first one to do this. And how do you consolidate your power once you've created this nation? The Spanish monarchs used the Inquisition to do it. It was the Inquisition was an official instrument of state terror, state sponsored terror. And they were hunting Jews, uh, a very anti Semitic instrument of state terror. Um, and people who were accused of practicing Judaism in secret were tortured, they were forced to recant, and then they were either executed or punished severely. And this basically scared everyone into proclaiming their loyalty. To this day, probably the most ham eaten by any country is eaten by Spaniards. Everywhere you go, there's a pig on a pole advertising a local restaurant. I kid you not. Um, everyone, and my theory is that basically they eat ham in order to make sure that everyone knows they're not Jewish. Okay. There's some evidence that crypto Jews settled New Mexico to try to get away from the Spanish Inquisition. Um, and that may be true in a sense. Although the Inquisition followed them right into New Mexico, in spite of the fact that New Mexico is isolated, God-forsaken area that had no interest to the Spanish Empire at all. If there were rumors of crypto Jews, the Inquisition would show up. And it was there on the ground about 20 years after the first settlers arrived. So the state becomes a nation. Of course, in consolidating their power, they also were able to expel the Jews and the Muslims from Spain and create a unified, quote unquote, Catholic monarchy. So they proclaimed this Catholicism as the official state religion. And if you're not Catholic, well, go somewhere else. That was the attitude that they had. And they proved it. And also, they colonized. They created the Spanish Empire, which was probably the largest and most powerful empire that had ever existed up to this point in history. The British, of course, eventually eclipsed the Spanish Empire, but not until the 18th century. So, right, consolidate your power, colonize, and this became the model for these European powers once they did so. And of course, in England, Henry VIII consolidated his power by proclaiming himself the head of his own church so that he could get a divorce from uh, from his Spanish wife, simply because she had not given birth to a male heir, and this was not something that was desirable. Henry needed a male heir to take over when he died as King of England, so he divorced his first wife and married Anne Boleyn, and since he was head of the church, he could give himself a divorce, and so he did that. And Boleyn didn't have a male child either, so he had her beheaded, and finally found Jane Seymour, who he married and did give him a male heir. And it gets even more complicated from there. nevertheless, again, it's this idea of consolidating power is very much that sort of nation state idea. The problem with the nation state in this period is that you've got this powerful shadow state in the church. And what do you do about that? Well, Henry basically said, "Oh well, I'll just proclaim myself to be head of my own church, and I'll do away with the Catholic Church in England," and he did so. So he consolidated power that way. There are a number of ways of doing it. But anyway, the state becomes the nation. And so we see, and then these nations colonize. And, I'm sitting here today because England colonized the east coast of what is now the United States, right? Um, and my ancestors arrived in 1635 in Virginia. So there you go. Um, and there you see Cortes, uh, who conquered Mexico and the Mixtec, otherwise known as Aztecs, and basically, you know, expanded the Spanish Empire into Mesoamerica, and then basically discovered that in Mesoamerica there was silver and gold, a lot more silver than gold, but you know, uh, this increased the riches of Spain and made everybody else want a piece of that pie. So, well, how does all this figure into music? Well, what happens with colonization is that, first of all, the Spaniards arrive, they colonize. Secondly, they treat the native peoples so brutally that they die out. And the ones that weren't killed by the Spaniards outright died of smallpox, measles, mumps, even chicken pox was a fatal disease. They didn't have any resistance to European diseases. So the native peoples' populations dwindled. So how are the Spaniards going to get people to work in the mines and in the plantations and various other places? They're not going to do it. Well, they import slaves from guess where? Africa. So slaves are imported into these colonies in the millions. It's estimated that about 22 million slaves were taken from West Africa, areas of West Africa, and sent to Brazil, the Caribbean, North America, Mexico, northern South America, and their ancestors, their descendants still live there today, as we well know. So exploration and colonization had the result of basically bringing people from Africa and from Europe together in these Creole communities, uh, and the music gets mixed together. And so later on in the semester, when we talk about American music, you'll see how that this creolization process really creates a lot of the music we know and love in North America, but also in Mesoamerica, in South America, uh, uh, across the entire so-called New World. The birthplace of the Renaissance is in the city of Florence, and um, major advance in painting happened right here in the baptistry of the Cathedral of Santa Maria dei Fiori. Um, there is the cathedral, and I just want to talk about the dome of this cathedral. It's a very large dome with a beautiful lantern on it constructed. Um, well, when this cathedral was being built, nobody had any idea about how this dome is going to be constructed. Nobody. They knew it was possible because, again, there's an ancient Roman building in Rome called the Pantheon that has a dome. So they knew the Romans had built one, so they knew that it was possible to build one. So they constructed this cathedral with a big hole in the roof. And so there's this massive hole where the dome should be. Um, and they believed that somebody at some point would come along and help them build this dome. And the guy's name was Brunelleschi. He didn't tell him how he was going to do it, so they had to trust him, believe it or not. And he did it. And it's there today to show off that Brunelleschi did it. We still don't know exactly how he did it because he kept it a secret. We can kind of figure it out from looking at the dome, but in order to really figure it out, we'd have to take the dome apart, and that's not going to happen. So, but there you see the Cathedral of Santa Maria dei Fiori in Florence, in Italy, and this eight-sided baptistry, all baptistries have 8 sides, by the way, is where perspective in painting was developed. Here is where they used mirrors, and they did a little experiment with perspective in painting, and they found out how to create the illusion of a 3-dimensional image within a 2-dimensional painting. Now, this has some bearing on music as well, and we'll get to that in a minute. So here is the reason how they did that. They did it by basically creating intersecting lines that basically intersected in the background. So in order to create this illusion of a 3-dimensional image, everything basically has a line that goes to a point in the back of the painting that intersects everything. So you see this wonderful perspective. Before 1450 or so, all the paintings were in 2 dimensions. They're all flat. There's no sense of perspective at all. But here after 1450, we get, and of course they publish their findings, and pretty soon all these painters are doing this thing because it's a huge technological advance in painting. So, you can tell a Renaissance painting pretty easily by, just noticing that perspective is there. And they all employed Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Masaccio, on, and Rembrandt later on. And realism. You can tell that Michelangelo had studied that wonderful Laocoon in Rome that came out of the cemetery, the Roman cemetery, because look at the detail here on the David's right hand. You see the veins, you see the underlying structures of ligaments and bone. How was he able to do this? He had dissected corpses in secret. So we get this idea of realism. And in the faces in paintings and in sculptures are not just lifelike, they're individuated. People look like who they are. Michelangelo's self-portraits, for instance, he looks like a prize fighter. He looks like a guy who's had his nose broken a bunch of times. And so he paints himself in a realistic way. He paints what he sees in the mirror. And this is who I am, guys. I'm sorry, I'm ugly, but I can't help it. So there's no idealized image of beauty here. There's just, this is how I look. And you can see his face in all kinds of places. One of his pietas. He did several pietas sculptures, and in one of the pietà, he presents himself as Nicodemus behind Mary holding the body of the dead Christ. And then in the back wall, the Last Judgment, he paints himself as the skin of Bartholomew. Saint Bartholomew had his skin flailed from his body. So Mary is in the center of the Last Judgment painting, is holding the flayed skin of Saint Bartholomew, and there you see the face of Michelangelo right there. So he paints himself as Saint Bartholomew. Yeah. So realism is a part of this, a huge part of the Renaissance, painting people as they really are, painting the human anatomy as it really appears. And the David is a great example of that. Of course, the great classic. It's today you can see it on the square outside the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. It used to be in the Accademia Museum, but it's moved back out there. It was moved indoors after the Great Flood in 1966, but just a couple of years ago was moved back to the Palazzo Vecchio. There you see the first Pietà that Michelangelo did, uh, a great sculpture, and again the attention to detail is surprising. Mary doesn't look old enough to have a 30-year-old son, but it's part of the appeal of the whole sculpture. That is in St. Peter's in Rome. And Moses. Notice Moses has horns. Why do you think Moses has horns? It comes from a mistranslation of the Bible. in, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, in Hebrew it says that rays of light are emanating from him after he's seen God face to face. But in the Septuagint it says horns. So, so since they were translating the Bible into Latin, they used the Septuagint a lot, so that it says corni, horns, and so Moses is depicted with horns. Okay, but again, attention to detail in the anatomy. It's truly an imposing sculpture. This is this statue you'll find in San Pietro, this little church called San Pietro in Vincoli, just up the hill from the Colosseum in Rome. And there's a good restaurant there, by the way. So this is quite an imposing statue. Well, I don't know if it's the downside, but it's one of the complications of printing. Since you can distribute information rapidly, and everyone is now learning to read, they're starting to read the Bible for themselves. The Bible had been basically locked away in monasteries and read by monks and bishops and others, but never had been available to the general public um, unless you could read Greek or Latin. There was a translation of the Bible into Latin that was read in church. But if you couldn't read Greek or Latin, um, and you didn't understand Latin anyway, there's no way you could read the Bible. So most people had no idea what was in the Bible. They just assumed that, the church people were telling them the truth about what was there. So all of a sudden now, in the in the in the 16th century, you can start reading the Bible for yourself, and people began to feel like the church had deceived them. And one of the people that felt most strongly about this was Martin Luther, and he began challenging some of the traditional practice of the church. The first one was the indulgences that I described earlier, the idea that you could pay a monk to pray the souls of your departed loved ones out of purgatory and into heaven. Luther said there's no mention of purgatory in the Bible. Indeed, there isn't. Um, and so, what need is there to pay somebody to pray the souls of your departed into heaven out of purgatory, since there is no purgatory? Um, another one he challenged was the priests, the idea that um, that priests had to be celibate. He says there's nothing about that in the New Testament or the Old. And so what's wrong? What's the problem with that? And on and on and on. The real presence in the sacraments of communion. The wine and the bread are changed into the literal body and blood of Jesus. Nothing about that. Okay, so he goes on and on. And the result here is something called the Protestant Reformation. Luther published extensively and criticized the church extensively. Now, he didn't want to leave the Catholic Church. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church. But he ended up having to leave the church because he was thrown out of the Catholic Church, excommunicated, if you will. And so this Protestant Reformation touches off it's like a bomb went off in the middle of Europe, and um, there is actual armed conflict. Um, Everyone who reads the Bible reads something differently, reads in a different way, and so we get multiple different kinds of um, uh, Protestant sects that start out of somebody's religious uh, convictions after reading the Bible. So it's not just Luther. It's a guy named Zwingli and John Calvin and Menno and dozens of others. They begin splitting apart into these different little sects. And so we get Lutherans and Calvinists and Mennonites and Anabaptists and on and on and on. And so, and of course, some of these little sects ended up coming to America um, in the 17th century, right? So we get the Pilgrims, who were a Calvinist group of separatists who left the Church of England and decided to to basically go into North America where the people would leave them alone so they could practice their own religion the way they wanted to. And then the Puritans showed up a few years after that, and on and on. So the Protestant Reformation is a huge development. How does this influence music? Well, Luther created his own set of hymns called the chorales. So the chorale tradition, the Lutheran chorale tradition, is what Luther invented in order to replace the Gregorian melodies of the church. So rather than singing Gregorian melodies in church services, Luther basically uh, caused these chorale melodies to be sung, and the chorale tunes are still part of our hymnals today. Even Catholic hymnals have some of these chorale tunes, and we'll be talking about that later as we go on. There you see a portrait of Josquin des Prés. Josquin des Prés was a composer who lived around the year 1500. So he was contemporary of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raffaello, these great sculptors and painters. And Josquin was a master of the art of imitation. And in your textbook, in chapter 5, it discusses imitation here on pages 50 and 51. Um, Music in the Middle Ages was polyphonic, but it usually wasn't imitative polyphony. There was imitation that was employed in the Gothic period, but it never caught on for one reason or another. We're not sure why. And so the polyphony in the Middle Ages was not imitative. Imitation is like row, row, row your boat. Um, right, where everyone sings row, row the tune, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Uh, Everybody sings that tune at a different time, and the tune harmonizes itself as it's sung. So this is a technique of polyphonic that basically consolidates that uh, polyphony into this more simple kind of idea of one single tune being sung at different times. So Josquin was a master of this imitative technique. And that's something that is an advance. It's a little bit like the discovery of perspective in painting, where all the lines converge. So you get a three-dimensional image out of a two-dimensional sheet of canvas. And imitation is a little bit like that. It simplifies the polyphonic structure of a piece to a great extent. And um, so on page 51 of your textbook, you have the sacred motet Ave Maria. And the Ave Maria is probably, if you've been exposed to the Catholic Church, you'll know this text. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, et cetera, et cetera. And so this text is just a Marian kind of motet uh, and praising Mary. It's a long-standing tradition in the Roman Catholic Church. And so there you see an appropriate kind of painting of the Annunciation, Gabriel announcing to Mary that she is going to have a child. Um, and she says, of course, how can that be since I don't know a man? And Gabriel explains it to her. And you notice this Da Vinci, this painting by Da Vinci, is employs these converging kinds of lines of perspective that converge on that mountain in the distance. So as you listen to this text, especially listen to the first part of the text, just these two words, Ave Maria, you have a wonderful kind of um, expression of polyphonic texture. This is four voices, a cappella, and it's imitative polyphony with some homophonic sections as well. So it's both homophonic and polyphonic at the same time. It's about 4.5 minutes long, and it's an incredibly beautiful piece of music. I absolutely adore Josquin des Prés. Um, but it's challenging to listen to for modern listeners because there are no instruments again. It's four voices, a cappella, no instrumental accompaniment whatsoever. And this is typical of Renaissance music. It's been pretty typical of medieval music as well. A lot of a cappella singing going on. Uh, the Renaissance is sort of the high watermark of a cappella choral singing. And so the music that we're going to be listening to here in the Renaissance is going to be largely a cappella, 4, 6, 8, 12 voices, whatever it is. And it's going to be imitative polyphony to a great extent. Um, so listen to the Ave Maria and listen hard so that you can hear what's going on with this imitative polyphony. The Ave Maria by Josquin des Prés is a great example of a sacred motet from the Renaissance. And many other composers were using these same sorts of compositional techniques with this imitative polyphony. Well, Josquin died in 1520, just as the Protestant Reformation was getting underway. So he was not really influenced by the Protestant Reformation or the church's response to it. But as time goes on, the Protestant Reformation grows and it becomes an enormous threat to the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church has to respond. And they finally got around to doing so with this thing called the Council of Trent. Uh, the Council of Trent met for almost 20 years. And they were formulating a response, a reaction to the Protestant Reformation in an attempt to attract Protestants back to the Catholic Church. Honest to God, there were wars being fought over this. People were dying in droves. And all that did is increase the resistance and the hatred that Protestants and Catholics felt. So there was this enmity between Protestants and Catholics that's growing during this period. So the church has to figure out how to attract, how do we get these uh, Protestants back? And well, you know, the cow had already left the barn, so they're not going to do this. But one of the things that they did, it was kind of peripheral to the rest of it, but it would have a tremendous effect on the music. Um, and one of the things they did was complain about this imitative polyphony, because the words are all being sung at different times since you have this imitation going on. And they said, we can't really understand the words. So can you please line the words up a little bit more? Yeah, the polyphony is beautiful, and we like it, but can you basically use less of it? So we get a recommendation to composers of sacred music here in the Catholic Church to basically create a more homorhythmic or homophonic kind of music so that we can sing the words and understand the words better. And one of the composers who was the most deeply affected by this Council of Trent was Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina. We call him Palestrina for short, which is really a misnomer. His real name is Giovanni Pierluigi. He just came from this little town called Palestrina. Uh, so, and Palestrina worked at the Sistine Chapel while St. Peter's was under construction. This vast, huge new church is being built while Palestrina is there in the Vatican working as a composer of sacred music. And so most of his music was written for performance in the Vatican, in the Sistine Chapel. And the paint was hardly dry on the ceiling and the Last Judgment, and he's basically writing for choral music in there. It's a glorious place to sing, by the way. And his music was in this imitative polyphonic style, a cappella, 4/6 voice imitative polyphony, similar to what Josquin had been doing a generation or so earlier. But now he's presented with a challenge. How do I write music that is in keeping with the recommendations of this Council of Trent? Well, he was a very fine composer, a musical genius, so he didn't really have much trouble doing it. And he did it in this piece called the Missa Papae Marcelle, Pope Marcellus Mass. Pope Marcellus had been the Pope who convened the Council of Trent and then died. He was only Pope for a few months. But he convened the council and then died. And what you have from the Pope Marcellus Mass here is on page 53. And again, it's the first movement of the Ordinary of the Mass. Palestrina set the Ordinary of the Mass, I don't know, dozens and dozens of times. So there are many, many settings by Palestrina of the Ordinary of the Mass, and also by lots of other Renaissance composers, including the great Josquin and Orlando di Lasso and many others setting the Ordinary of the Mass. So it's not unusual to have a setting of the Ordinary of the Mass by Palestrina, but it is kind of unusual to have it be as homorhythmic and homophonic as it is. And that's because he is dedicating this to the Pope who convened the council. And so what you're going to hear is the first movement of this Pope Marcellus Mass, the Kyrie eleison. And you notice it's a Greek text, just 6 words in this ABA format. And so you're going to hear basically more of a homorhythmic or homophonic setting of this. Still lots of polyphonic texture. Palestrina couldn't get away from that. And but nevertheless, it's a wonderful, beautiful setting of the Kyrie from the Ordinary of the Mass. Well, just as with the medieval troubadours, trouvères, minnesingers, others, we have a secular music tradition. And since music now can be published and printed and published, it basically explodes. The secular music explodes all across Europe, and it comes out of Italy. Italy becomes this publishing center for music. The first published music uh, came from Venice. Venice was a hub of printing, and a guy named Petrucci in Venice discovered a way to print music. And so the first printed music dates from around the year 1499, 1500. And it's called the Odecaton. It really is the top 99 songs, if you will, from the 15th century. It's sort of a fake book, if you will, of the top hits of the 15th century. Josquin is represented there. Josquin wrote some wonderful secular music. And again, these texts of this Renaissance secular music are in they're love texts, similar to what we heard with the troubadours and trouvères, and uh, they're in the vernacular. In other words, in Italy, they're published in Italian. In France, we have the chanson. Uh, chanson just means song in French, and they're published in French. And in Germany, it's called the Lied, and they're published in German, on and on. So we get these the vernacular texts. The difference, of course, is that instead of being monophonic like the troubadours and trouvères in the Middle Ages, these are 4, 6, 8 voice choral pieces. So we have this a cappella choral tradition and moving into the secular realm here. And so, and in Italy, we get the all kinds of secular music forms, but the major one, the one that's published most often, and the one that attracts the best composers is the madrigal. A madrigal is just a 4, 6 voice a cappella piece set to a short love poem, and it employs something called word painting. The madrigal basically musically depicts what's going on in the text. So, and you're going to hear an example of that here in a second. So the madrigal depicts the text using word painting. So if you're going up a hill, you hear an ascending scale. If someone is alone, you hear a single voice. If you're going up and down, the music goes up and down. It goes on and on like that. The interesting thing about the madrigal is that it gets exported out of England, out of Italy, into England. Well, how does that happen? Well, again, remember I mentioned Anne Boleyn earlier, Henry VIII's second wife. He divorced his first wife, married Anne Boleyn, and she had one child. The child was named Elizabeth. Well, he beheaded his Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, and um, married Jane Seymour, who had one child named Edward. Well, so Henry VIII felt like he'd done his duty as king and he'd had a male child, and this was all fine and good. So when Henry VIII died, Edward came to the throne, but he only lived a few years. Edward, I think, had tuberculosis and it killed him. So now what? Well, now we got to go. We get a choice. We can have Mary, right, um, the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, as queen, um, and then the second in line to the throne is Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. So Mary comes to the throne, but she only reigned about 5 years. In England they call her Bloody Mary because she persecuted the Protestants terribly. But she only reigned about 5 years, and she died of cancer. And so now Elizabeth is left. Elizabeth almost died of smallpox, but she comes to the throne. Well, Elizabeth turns out to be one of the most effective monarchs in English history. She was on the throne of England for 40 some years, and she was quite a queen. And everyone basically had to basically do what she told them. She was pretty powerful. Um, and so, what does this mean for musicians? Well, musicians are employed at the court by the queen. They exist at her pleasure. She can basically hire them or fire them. And they discovered very early on in her reign that she liked madrigals. So these court musicians said, we can curry favor with the queen by composing these madrigals in English. So they took the Italian madrigal that she liked so much, took it out of it, imported it to England from Italy, and began setting these short poems in English to these, to please the queen. And So there are these huge, and again, they publish these things so everyone in England can perform them, and they still exist today. And if you've been in a high school choir, you may have sung one of these or two of these. Orlando Gibbons, Thomas Weelkes, the famous raging alcoholic composer, uh, John Farmer, John Bennett. The madrigals, these English madrigals, are sung all over North America by high school choirs and others. I've sung a lot of them myself. So there you have Queen Elizabeth in all her splendor, tons of cakes of makeup to hide all the smallpox scars. And oh, by the way, the makeup was lead based, so it created more skin damage as time went on. You didn't want to see the Queen without her makeup. But so, but you've got this wonderful example of an English madrigal here on page 56, Fair Phyllis, and it's a four-voice polyphonic uh, madrigal set to the short love text. You can see it there on page 56 of your textbook, and um, and again, there's a lot of imitation, a lot of polyphonic, lots of word painting. You can listen if you listen to it enough. You can point out the word painting, although it has a more of a homophonic ending. It's still imitative polyphony. So listen to this wonderful example of a madrigal, and yeah, there are composers that are still writing madrigals today. So it's not limited to the Renaissance. So by the year 1580 or so, we begin seeing people writing more and more for instruments. And one of the most common instruments that people composed for was the lute. And there you see John Dowland with his lute writing music with a quill, you see. Uh, and yeah, Dowland was a very popular composer of lute songs in England in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Um, these lute songs basically are um, a token of things to come as we begin seeing more and more composers writing for instruments and voices together. At St. Mark's in Venice, in Italy, uh, Gabrieli, the composer at St. Mark's, was writing for brass and chorus and organ and all together. So at St. Mark's, we see the beginnings of this composers beginning to write for instruments. And in England, we see Dowland here writing songs for voice and lute. So this this is the beginning of what we're going to see during the Baroque period in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Lots and lots of instrumental music, music for combinations of voices and instruments. Here we see a solo voice with lute and cello accompanying. And that's a very typical Baroque kind of musical timbre and structure. So listen to Flow My Tears. This is on page 57. Uh, and Flow My Tears is a wonderful sort of text. It also concentrates on one emotion, uh, what we would call pathos or extreme sadness. This is also a feature of the Baroque. We see a movement in a Baroque sonata or a concerto or an aria in a Baroque opera or an aria in a Baroque oratorio or a cantata usually concentrates on one emotion, one emotional state. And so Flow My Tears is an example of extreme sadness. So it's a sad song and it sounds sad. And um, right, where night's blackbird her sad infamy sings. There, let me live forlorn. Typical sort of, you know, it sounds like Hank Williams, right? I'm so lonesome I could cry. Um, Same sort of thing. But so listen to the lute song. it's strophic. So we get a strophic song. We haven't heard a lot of strophic songs. Certainly, the chorale tradition that comes out of the Renaissance is mainly strophic as well. Uh, but here we have these lute songs are strophic. The verse, I think there are 4 verses in this lute song. Also, we get a lot of instrumental music in this late Renaissance period. The instruments are not modern instruments. They consist of some of those old medieval instruments that we saw portrayed in that painting of Walter von der Vogelweide with his group of instrumental players singing and playing. So yeah, wooden flutes, recorders, shawms, sometimes the bagpipe, drums, the lute. These ancient instruments are used by various composers up after the year 1580 or so, and so we get secular dance music. We get sacred music for chorus and orchestra. And so we're seeing more and more instrumental music towards the end of the Renaissance. And one of the premier sort of secular instrumental guys was a guy named Pretorius, Michael Pretorius. And you have an example of his dance music here on page 59, the 3 dances from Terpsichore. This would have been written for some sort of official state occasion. So, as I was mentioning in the previous slide with John Dowland, we see increasing use of instrumental music towards the end of the 16th century, from about 1580 or so on. And so it's not too surprising that we'd find a composer who is composing dance music for instruments and instruments only. Now, this sort of thing is really going to take off after 1600. We're going to get all kinds of instrumental music. But here we've got Michael Pretorius, a German composer who was working for a duke at a in a court in Germany, and Pretorius composed about 300 or so of these dances. And these dances were probably commissioned by the duke he's working for all kinds of state occasions and various other sorts of festive events. So these dances are basically they serve the needs of the court of the duke, and this is something that's been going on for a while and will continue to go on. Composers usually worked for some sort of aristocrat or some sort of wealthy churchman, and Pretorius is certainly no exception to that. So these dances from Terpsichore are good examples of Renaissance instruments being employed in dance music. The instruments are different from modern instruments. They tend to be these medieval or Renaissance instruments, wooden recorders, which are duct flutes of certain kinds, a shawm or two. Uh, you don't hear bagpipes here, but you might at some point. So and these drums, you hear a very engaging rhythm set out by the drums, and you also have a very pronounced downbeat. This is really important. Um, you may have noticed this. If you didn't notice it, you're wondering what's going on. With music by Josquin, Palestrina, and these other Renaissance composers, when they're writing in this imitative polyphonic style with points of imitation, there's no downbeat. So you can't go 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a flat beat. In other words, all the beats are somewhat equal in importance, and that's because everybody really gets their own um, rhythmic structure because the voices all come in singing the same thing but at different times. So you really can't have much of a downbeat. But here with these dances, you can almost hear them hitting the downbeat really hard. It's as though they're stomping or something, you know, and that's maybe part of the whole deal for this dance. So there's a pronounced downbeat here, even though it's you do have some polyphonic texture. You have rhythmic instruments, giving us a much more pronounced rhythm. And that's going to be true coming up, when we talk about the Baroque, uh, in the coming weeks. Um, the rhythmic structure of Baroque music is very dance-like. It's very and so it's much more active rhythmically than what we've been listening to with the Renaissance. So listen to these dances from Terpsichore and enjoy. And we'll talk more about um, this sort of dancey kind of Baroque music later on. Thank you.